Birth of a blade. The origins of the hellebarde. In the cold breath of the Alps, where the jagged mountains cut the sky and snow clung stubbornly to the earth, the 14th century birthed a weapon of singular defiance. The weapon was not born from the golden halls of kings or the elite forges of noble smiths, but from the rough, calloused hands of farmers turned soldiers, peasants who refused to kneel before knights clad in steel. They were men of the old Swiss Confederacy, and they forged the hellebarde not to glorify war, but to survive it. At the time, heavy cavalry dominated the battlefield, sweeping across open plains with lances poised and armor glinting like dragon scale. Mounted knights, often nobles, were considered nearly invincible, the thunder of their horses hooves enough to scatter common infantry. But the Swiss, surrounded by enemies and driven by necessity, refused to accept the myth of cavalry invulnerability. Instead of retreating, they studied. And from necessity came invention. The earliest ancestors of the hellebarde were agricultural tools: wood-cutting axes, shepherd's spears, hooks for pulling down branches or dragging fallen logs. These tools were quickly adapted for warfare. What resulted was a weapon both familiar and revolutionary. A fusion of polearm, axe, spear, and hook, designed not just to kill, but to dismantle the very advantage of the mounted warrior. Thus, in the late 1300s, the hellebarde made its first recorded appearance in Swiss militias. The name itself comes from the Middle High German, Haum meaning staff or handle, and Bart meaning axe. It was an honest name. It did not boast like the swords of lords or shimmer with mystique like the Eastern saber. It simply told you what it was: a staff with an axe, and if you did not respect it, you bled. The design was immediately effective. On one side of the steel head, a curved axe blade was mounted for slashing through mail and bone. On the reverse side, a hook or beak, crafted with a sharp inward curve, was perfected for yanking riders from the saddle or dragging enemy shields away. The crowning feature was a thrusting spear point, which gave the weapon deadly reach and allowed it to pierce through armor with surgical precision. All of this was fixed atop a 6 to 8 foot long ashwood pole, giving the wielder both distance and leverage. The first battle that truly etched the hellebarde into the annals of history was the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. In that clash, a Swiss force of farmers and militias ambushed a superior Austrian army led by Duke Leopold I. The narrow mountain pass where the battle took place favored infantry over cavalry, and the Swiss exploited every inch of that terrain. They wielded long poles and crude prototypes of the hellebarde to devastating effect, sweeping knights from their horses, crushing them underfoot, and overwhelming the armor-clad elite with a ferocity that stunned the nobility of Europe. The victory at Morgarten marked not only the rise of Swiss tactical genius but also the rise of a new kind of weapon. Over the next few decades, Swiss cantons continued to refine the hellebarde. The heads became more standardized and forged by blacksmiths who had begun to specialize in polearms. The weapons were balanced for both offense and defense, allowing foot soldiers to hold a line against cavalry charges and then press forward into hand-to-hand combat. The hellebarde became the equalizer of the battlefield. More than a weapon, it became a symbol of Swiss identity, resistance, and the idea that courage and cunning could match any coat of arms or bloodline. From the Alps to the flatlands of Burgundy, stories spread of Swiss warriors felling armored foes with graceful arcs of the hellebarde, splitting helms, pulling down banners, and turning the tide of war. By the early 15th century, the weapon had become a standard issue for infantry throughout the Swiss Confederation. And with Swiss mercenaries gaining renown across Europe, the hellebarde traveled with them. First into Italy, then France, Austria, and beyond. It was no longer a local weapon. It was becoming a continental phenomenon. Each culture that adopted it left its mark. In Italy, it was slightly shortened for street combat. In France, ceremonial versions began to appear in royal courts. In Germany, the Landsknecht, flamboyant and deadly mercenaries, elevated the hellebarde to an art form. But no matter where it went, the origin remained remembered. It was still called by its Germanic name, hellebarde, a constant reminder that this was the tool of mountain men who humbled empires. The shift in battlefield philosophy that followed in its wake was profound. No longer did armor guarantee supremacy. No longer did the high-born knight hold an unquestioned edge. With the hellebarde, a disciplined infantryman could stand his ground and win. And that, perhaps, was its greatest victory. Steel and ash, composition and construction. If the soul of the hellebarde was born in the defiant minds of the Swiss, then its body was shaped by the hammer, the anvil, and centuries of pragmatic refinement. It was not merely a tool of destruction. It was a carefully engineered instrument of war, each component chosen, balanced, and honed for a specific purpose. To understand the hellebarde's fearsome reputation is to appreciate the brutal elegance of its construction. At its heart lay the haft, the staff or pole, usually made from ash wood, a choice not born of whim but of wisdom. Ash was known throughout medieval Europe for its durability, flexibility, and light weight. A lesser wood might shatter under the force of impact or warp under environmental strain, but ash had an uncanny ability to absorb shock without breaking. Its straight, grainy structure made it perfect for a weapon that needed both reach and resilience. The shaft typically ranged between 6 and 8 feet long, a length chosen with precision. Too short, and it would leave the wielder vulnerable to a charging knight. Too long, and it would become unwieldy in the tight formations of infantry ranks. In battle, Swiss pikemen wielding the hellebarde were expected to move not just as individuals, but as a synchronized machine. Their polearms had to be as responsive as a swordsman's blade. Fast, fluid, lethal. But the real genius of the hellebarde lay in the head. Forged from high-carbon steel, the blade assembly was not a simple point of metal. Rather, it was a trinity of destruction, each side honed to perfection. The axe blade, mounted on one flank of the steel head, was wide and curved, often with a beveled edge to allow clean slicing through flesh, leather, and light armor. It was the most immediately visible part of the weapon, the bart that gave the hellebarde half its name. Unlike traditional axes, this blade was not meant for chopping wood. It was tempered to cleave through mail, to dig into shields, to split helmets, and in desperate moments to sever limbs. Opposite the axe blade, often angled downward, was the beak or hook, a vicious, pointed projection crafted for tactical dismemberment. This was no decorative flourish. The hook was designed to exploit weakness, to catch under a mounted knight's arm, to drag a shield from a defender's grasp, or to pierce vulnerable gaps in plate armor. When used correctly, it could unhorse a rider in a single pull or disarm an opponent mid-combat. The edges were sharpened not for cutting, but for tearing, a cruel and effective mechanism. Crowning the top of the weapon was the spear point, or thrusting spike. Often diamond-shaped and precisely tapered, it transformed the hellebarde into a deadly thrusting spear, able to punch through the chinks of plate armor or skewer a man at a distance. It extended the user's reach, allowing soldiers to strike over the shoulders of comrades or fend off enemies before they closed in. Unlike the decorative spear tips of ceremonial halberds in later centuries, the original points were forged with one goal: penetration. Armor was no salvation against it. Crucially, these three components, the axe, the hook, and the spear, were not separate weapons crudely combined, as some might assume. They were part of a single unified design, all three forged from one continuous piece of steel, known as the head assembly. This piece was then fitted into a reinforced steel socket that enveloped the top of the wooden haft. To ensure durability, blacksmiths would rivet or nail the head securely into place, sometimes reinforcing the haft with languettes, narrow steel strips running down the shaft to prevent enemy blades from chopping it apart. Balance was essential. A well-crafted hellebarde was not front-heavy despite its massive head. Skilled smiths ensured the weapon could be whirled, jabbed, and chopped with minimal fatigue, pivoting naturally in the wielder's hands. This balance made the hellebarde a weapon of both brutality and finesse, one that rewarded training and punished hesitation. Decoration, while rare on battlefield versions, was not unheard of. Some hellebarden bore etched designs, unit markings, or insignia of cities, cantons, or commanders. These were not vanity flourishes. They identified regiments, signified elite units, or marked special ceremonial pieces for guard duty. Later, in the Renaissance, hellebarden used by ceremonial guards, particularly in royal courts and the Vatican, would be adorned with gilded elements, engraved scrollwork, or bright pennants, transforming them from weapons into symbols of sovereignty. However, on the battlefield, function reigned supreme. The most effective hellebarden were simple, deadly, and brutally practical. Maintenance was crucial. Soldiers were trained to sharpen the axe edge, clean the steel, and inspect the haft for cracks before every engagement. A dull axe or a splintered pole could mean death in the heat of battle. Some soldiers even customized their weapons, adding additional spikes, replacing the hook with a flanged hammerhead, or wrapping the shaft in leather strips for better grip. The halberd was also modular in its battlefield utility. In sieges, it could hook and pull down ladders. In close combat, the haft became a club. In desperation, the entire weapon could be reversed, using the butt end to knock, trip, or shove. This versatility made it a favorite among sergeants, guards, and frontline infantry commanders. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the halberd's construction was its psychological power. The sight of a wall of pole arms, each tipped with a cruel trinity of steel, could sap the will of even veteran cavalry. As a knight thundered forward, lance poised, he saw not the faces of men, but a forest of glittering blades, hooks waiting to snag him from his saddle, axe heads waiting to break his armor. The halberd was more than a weapon. It was a message, a warning. In a time when technology was slowly changing the face of war, the halberd stood as a masterpiece of low-tech superiority. No gears, no fire, no black powder. Just ash, steel, and technique. It was a synthesis of ancient weapon principles. Axe, spear, hook, crafted into one terrifyingly effective tool. Its very existence defied the status quo of medieval warfare. It told the world that the age of the knight was ending, that the future belonged to formations, to strategy, to weapons that didn't need noble birth to wield. And so, every time a Swiss soldier stepped onto the battlefield with a halberd in hand, he carried not just a tool of war, but a weapon shaped by rebellion, crafted with intent, and perfected by the need to survive, win, and endure. March across the continent. Use in warfare. By the dawn of the 15th century, the halberd had ceased to be merely a Swiss creation. It had become an emissary of a new military age, carried not just by mountain warriors but by armies marching across the breadth of Europe. As empires collided and mercenaries sold their steel to the highest bidder, the halberd became more than a weapon. It became a doctrine, a battle philosophy etched in blood and steel. In the heartlands of Switzerland, where the weapon first earned its reputation, the halberd was field-tested against every conceivable threat. Battles like Sempach 1386 and Naples 1388 confirmed its effectiveness not only against cavalry but in pitched infantry engagements as well. At Sempach, Swiss foot soldiers using halberds shattered an Austrian noble army, their formations cutting through chainmail and crushing helmets with disciplined fury. The dead were counted not in dozens, but in hundreds, and among them were many knights who had once believed their armor to be invincible. But the halberd did not remain confined to Alpine passes and Swiss cantons. The fame of Swiss mercenaries, especially their pikemen and halberdiers, spread across the courts and battlefields of Europe. Swiss soldiers were seen not merely as fighters, but as professionals in an age when professionalism was rare. Their signature weapon traveled with them, and before long, other nations took notice. In Germany, the weapon found new life in the hands of the Landsknecht, flamboyant and feared mercenary bands known for their brutal efficiency and distinctive puffed clothing. The Landsknecht wielded halberds with flair and precision, often using modified versions with longer spikes, heavier axe heads, or ornate engravings. For them, the halberd was not only a battlefield implement but a symbol of authority and pride. Commanders and sergeants among their ranks carried it as both a tool of war and an emblem of rank. On the battlefield, they formed devastating formations, combining halberds, pikes, and Zweihander swords, crushing less disciplined foes through sheer coordination and overwhelming strength. France and Italy were quick to follow. In the Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, French and Spanish armies found themselves hiring or imitating Swiss halberdiers. In Italy, where city-states fought endlessly for dominance, the halberd was employed in tight urban combat, its axe head used to cleave through the chaos of crowded streets and narrow alleys. Italian engineers began to refine the weapon further, sometimes producing lighter versions with sharpened crescent blades or fluted spikes for increased armor penetration. The Holy Roman Empire incorporated the halberd into both field armies and palace guards. It became a versatile tool, used on open plains, in siege warfare, and even as a disciplinary implement by officers. The presence of a halberd-wielding sergeant was enough to restore order in a chaotic unit. Within royal courts, it also gained ceremonial significance, becoming the chosen weapon of palace guards and elite protectors. This dual function, combat and ceremony, further extended its life well beyond its battlefield prime. One of the most iconic and enduring adoptions of the halberd occurred in Vatican City, where the Swiss Guard, established in 1506, wielded it as their primary armament. Though largely ceremonial by then, the symbolism was unmistakable. The Vatican's defenders bore the same weapon that had repelled empires. These halberds were exquisitely crafted, longer, more ornate, often featuring gilded patterns, etched religious symbols, or the papal insignia. But their shape remained faithful to the original Swiss design. But the halberd was not invincible. By the mid-16th century, the increasing prevalence of gunpowder weaponry, particularly arquebus and early muskets, began to shift the nature of warfare. Infantry formations still needed polearms, but the balance began to tip in favor of pikes, which provided better defense against cavalry in large squares. As firearms gained accuracy and reliability, the close-quarters dominance of the halberd diminished. Yet it refused to vanish. Rather than disappearing, the halberd evolved. In smaller military units, particularly those stationed in fortresses, castles, and city gates, the weapon remained standard. Its ability to fight in close quarters, to hook enemies, to strike from odd angles, and to disarm, made it invaluable in situations where firearms were cumbersome or unreliable. In mutinies, riots, or prison breaks, a halberd-wielding guard could quell violence with brutal speed. It also took on a new role in military rituals and executions. In many European cities, the official executioner carried a halberd or axe variant. In some cases, the halberd was used for beheading, a grim reminder of its sharpness and utility. Across Germany, France, and Spain, guards lined the halls of justice, courtrooms, and dungeons with halberds gleaming, a warning to all who would defy order. Meanwhile, in the New World, while never a frontline weapon during colonization, halberds made appearances in early European expeditions. Officers aboard Spanish ships or explorers moving through the Americas carried halberds as signs of rank and command, sometimes even using them as walking sticks in rugged terrain or spears against wild beasts. Even as the 17th century dawned, and matchlocks thundered across muddy fields, the halberd was far from forgotten. It appeared in military manuals, was used for training soldiers in discipline, and often remained part of the arsenal of reserve forces and militias. In many regions, particularly in Scandinavia and the Germanic states, the halberd endured as a badge of authority, wielded by guards, town watchmen, and ceremonial officials well into the 18th century. The armies that had once carried it, the Swiss militias, the Landsknecht, the French mercenaries, the Italian condottieri, may have laid down their weapons, but the legacy of the halberd marched on. It became the silent observer of revolutions, standing in the hands of palace guards as monarchies fell, watched over parades, guarded coronations, and lined cathedrals where history turned like the tide. But for all its ceremony, the halberd never lost its battle-born identity. Every ornate version was still based on a design that had once cleaved armor and dragged nobles into the dust. No matter how polished or engraved, every halberd was a descendant of war. Today, in military museums across Europe, original battlefield halberden rest behind glass, scarred, rusted, and still formidable. In some, blood has stained the shaft. Others bear deep notches from parried blades. Each tells a story of a time when soldiers stood not behind muskets or cannons, but behind lines of steel-tipped poles, gripping their halberds with hands hardened by frost, fire, and fear. And though the battlefield has long changed, the halberd's march across the continent left footprints not easily erased. Legacy of a name. From battlefield to ceremony. The battlefield echoes of the halberd faded slowly, not with the clang of defeat, but with a transformation that few weapons in history have achieved. From brutal instrument of war to revered symbol of honor, authority, and remembrance. While the roar of gunpowder eventually drowned out the hiss of steel and the charge of cavalry, the halberd refused to vanish. It endured not merely as a relic of the past but as a silent guardian of tradition, its legacy sealed in iron, ash, and memory. By the 17th century, gunpowder weaponry had irreversibly altered the nature of warfare. Muskets, cannons, and pistols now dictated the rhythm of battle. Long-range volleys replaced disciplined ranks of halberdiers. The sword and spear made way for flint and spark. Yet, in the shadows of modernity, the silhouette of the halberd still loomed. In castles, palaces, city gates, and state processions, it remained, no longer to kill, but to remind. Its very appearance was timeless. Even as newer weapons were cast in brass and steel, the halberd retained its archaic allure, a broad, sweeping axe, a hooked spike, and a long steel thrusting point, all forged together into a three-faced monument of medieval warfare. Its shaft, often still made from ash, was now sometimes lacquered, polished, or even inlaid with ivory or silver. These were not battlefield halberds, but ceremonial masterpieces, weapons forged not in urgency but in reverence. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the halberd is found in the hands of the Pontifical Swiss Guard of the Vatican. Founded in 1506 by Pope Julius II, this elite guard adopted the halberd as their signature weapon, honoring the Swiss soldiers whose discipline, loyalty, and military prowess had saved the papacy during tumultuous times. To this day, when the Swiss Guard marches through the Apostolic Palace or stands watch during papal audiences, their halberds are present. Glistening under the Roman sun, crafted with the same tri-point design used centuries ago in the Alpine passes. These halberds are not simple stage props. They are heirlooms of identity. Each one is handcrafted by skilled artisans, sometimes passed from guard to guard, their blades inscribed with mottos in Latin, the shafts burnished with the coats of arms of commanders or popes. The men who carry them undergo rigorous training, not because they are expected to use them in combat, but because carrying a halberd demands an understanding of its weight, history, and meaning. Beyond the Vatican, halberds continued to stand ceremonial watch in the palaces of kings, the embassies of emperors, and the halls of parliament. In Germany, the halberd became a common weapon of municipal guards. Men charged with keeping peace in towns and cities, dressed in half-armor and bearing polearms that projected authority. In Scandinavia, it remained in service through the 18th and 19th centuries, seen in royal guards, parades, and state functions. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, halberden were used not only by palace guards but also as honor weapons. Distinguished guests entering the Hofburg Palace or Schönbrunn would often pass between guards flanking the grand halls, their halberds held upright in ceremonial salute. These weapons were sometimes engraved with imperial emblems and affixed with velvet tassels or gilded trims, transforming tools of war into regalia of power. The halberd even found its way into judicial symbolism. In certain cities across Europe, the halberd was displayed in courts and execution grounds. The bearer of the halberd, the sergeant at arms, was often tasked with enforcing the authority of the magistrate. At public executions, a halberd was planted into the earth beside the platform, a grim reminder that the hand of justice could still strike as swiftly as war. But the halberd's transformation didn't stop at ceremony. It entered the world of myth and memory. Chroniclers, painters, and playwrights began to depict it as the weapon of the noble defender, the watchman, the last sentinel on the wall. In tapestries and oil paintings, halberdiers stood alongside saints and sovereigns. Their towering weapons served as both literal and symbolic shields against the chaos of the world. In museums, the halberd became a star attraction. Armories in Vienna, Zurich, Lucerne, and Paris proudly displayed examples from every era, some still bearing dents from battle, others shimmering with ceremonial splendor. Visitors gazed in awe at the craftsmanship, the fine filigree around the axe blades, the intricate rivets securing the socket, the faintly worn leather grips on the hafts. Each halberd whispered stories of blood and loyalty, of rebellion and honor. Historians began to study it not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of democratic military structure. Unlike the sword, which was often the badge of the nobility, the halberd had been the weapon of the common soldier, the sergeant, the citizen warrior. It had not required noble lineage to wield, only discipline, courage, and skill. In this way, the halberd became a symbol of equality before battle, a reminder that in the right hands, even a farmer could bring down a knight. Even in modern fiction, echoes of the halberd persist. In fantasy literature, video games, and films, characters bearing polearms are often depicted as loyal guards, elite warriors, or silent protectors. The shape of the weapon, so unique and unmistakable, continues to inspire the imagination. It is often associated with steadfastness, vigilance, and a touch of old-world mystique. Today, in an age of drones, satellites, and hypersonic missiles, the halberd stands as a monument to an age when battle was personal, when victory was measured not in payloads dropped but in inches of ground gained by grit and blood, when warriors did not press buttons from afar, but stood eye to eye with death and held their line with nothing more than a shaft of ash and a blade of iron. The name halberd itself endures in language and legend. Across Europe, it is still spoken with a tone of reverence. Derived from the Old German Halm and Bart, it reminds us of its roots, a staff and an axe. But behind the name lies a deeper truth. It is the story of a weapon that transcended its purpose, a tool of war that became a heritage, a ceremony, a symbol. So when you see a halberd resting behind glass in a museum, or gleaming in the hand of a papal Swiss guard under the dome of St. Peter's, know that you are not looking at a simple artifact. You are looking at discipline made manifest. You are looking at the shadow of men who defied empire, the echo of warriors who carved history with edge and hook. You are looking at a legend. You are looking at the halberd.